Hi guys, today I'm going to be doing the first of an eventual 3 episodes on Bob Dylan's rock albums he did in 1965 and 1966. Today's episode will be for Bringing It All Back Home, the next one for Highway 61, so on and so forth. This is something I've really always wanted to do. I've always wanted to have a more narrative slant to some of my series than I've been able to. I tried that early on with the Primus episodes, I think to mixed success. A lot of people really like the Primus episodes. I don't anymore. I liked them when I was making them, of course, but, 3 years and a lot of extra knowledge have made them really hard for me to watch. This is going to be kind of like that. It's mostly I'm going to review the 3 albums and provide some context and my thoughts about the context. Basically nothing too special, but it provides me with an opportunity to talk about an artist that I haven't gotten to talk about yet. So this album, Bringing It All Back Home, is Dylan's 5th overall in the span of about 3 years, because the early to mid-60s were a time when you were expected to put out at least an album a year, and sometimes 2. But it's a major departure from his previous albums. Prior to this album, he had been a folk musician, one of the leading figures of the folk revival of the early 60s. I'm not going to go too deep in terms of giving background for Bob Dylan, because probably hundreds of books have been written about this man and his music, so I'll leave it to them and I'll leave it to Wikipedia. However, it's important to know that he was a folkie because the following he cultivated largely did not like this album. Because I get the sense that the folkies of the era were very snooty and very arrogant and looked upon rock music as beneath them. And that is understandable to an extent. In 1962 and 1963, I could very easily see somebody looking down on the rock of the day. But by 1965, things were different, because this was really a time of change for pop, rock and pop. I always talk about 65 to people as the year that pop music grew a brain. Whether it's Brian Wilson's lush orchestral pop stylings finally blossoming into full flower on Today, or whether it's Ray Davies finally starting to write the kind of introspective, narrative-oriented songs that he is so amazing at on The Kink Controversy. Because as we know, rock turned out to be much longer-lived than the folk revival that had catapulted him to fame in the first place. But at the time, that was a controversial move. But enough backstory, onto the album itself. Unlike the 2 records that followed it, Bringing It All Back Home is half electric and half folk. It almost feels as if Dylan couldn't quite bring himself to make the whole album a rock record. Although in fairness to him, some of these tracks probably wouldn't have worked as rock songs. What an album opener. Sure, the melody is very derivative, and particularly it reminds me of Chuck Berry's Too Much Monkey Business. But what a shock this must have been in 1965. To put on a record and hear lyrics this weird and this good on a rock song. Judging by the title alone, you would expect this track to be just another entry in the classic list of vaguely misogynistic relationship songs throughout R&B, blues, and early rock and roll. But in fact, it's a very nice ballad. Despite the fact that he's singing about this woman and describing all these things about her, he never once mentions his relationship with her or her relationship with him, leading me to wonder if the title of the song actually has any correlation to its contents at all. Okay, so now we are firmly entering the realm of Dylan legend here. This is a very famous song, as is Subterranean Homesick Blues, but this one features almost more strongly in his mythos, because supposedly this is the song that everybody booed when he first debuted the rock band side of his act live in 1965. And lyrically, we are also in classic Bob Dylan what does it mean territory. Is he singing about his relationship with the record company? His relationship with his fans? His relationship with society? Or alternatively, is he just singing about how he doesn't want to work for Maggie anymore? This is basically just another gentle ballad. very much like She Belongs to Me, but I actually like it a lot more than that song for whatever reason. Lyrically, they are very much in the same vein. He's showering praise upon his woman and talking about all the things that she is, while also describing some interesting stuff that may or may not be related to the actual subject of the song. Okay, this is basically just Bob Dylan doing very, very basic blues. And basic blues is something that I have mixed feelings on. If it's not done amazingly well, and if it's not done by the masters, I tend to get bored with it very easily. And I do get a little bored by this song. This strikes me as a maybe semi-comedic track about the troubles of being an artist in the modern world and also the stresses of living with the in-laws, with some really wonderfully absurd little bits in there about canes turning into swords and father-in-laws wearing Napoleon masks. It is a bit blah musically, but it has some real energy that makes it stand out to a greater degree than some of the other tracks on here. Whether the flub at the beginning of this song is real or not, and yes, that is a debate that has happened. I have seen this debate, and I have seen some very interesting takes on this debate. It's a great addition to the song, in that it adds even more humor to what is already a very silly track. Basically, it's a remake of Motorcylce Nightmare from another side of Bob Dylan, but with new lyrics, and a story that is even more absurd than the first time we heard this song. So we flip the record over to side 2, and we are once again firmly in the realm of Dylan legend here, and we really won't be leaving it for the rest of the album, because pretty much every song on side 2 is regarded highly within the Dylan canon. And Mr. Tambourine Man is only the most obvious example of that. This song has endured in the public eye for many, many years, partially because the Byrds covered it, partially because it's sat on one of the most influential albums of the last 60 years. So now we've arrived at the actual acoustic part of the album with The Gates of Eden, which is an incredibly strange and bleak song. Dylan's lyrics here are beyond surreal, and the overall tone of the song seems to go to a pretty dark place. I get this vague sense that he's decrying people who look for some greater inner truth in this life, when, from his perspective, there is no truth in this life. The only truth in this life is that there is no truth. Musically, this is very much along the same lines as some of his earlier, longer protest anthems, but the instrumentation is much better, and that's something I really like here. There's a lot, the guitar work has gotten more sophisticated. There are little flourishes here and there that really help set the background to the song, and really help to support Dylan's incredibly bleak and pessimistic lyrics. So the album ends with It's All Over Now, Baby Blue, and it's one of the best endings to any Dylan album, and certainly his best up to this point. We are once again in what does it mean territory, but I won't really engage in that. My broad interpretation of the song is that it's probably about the end of a relationship. Not necessarily a specific relationship, but just a general relationship. And the choruses in particular perfectly exude the sadness that comes with that sort of thing, and the sense of bittersweetness and melancholy as one moves on. Bringing It All Back Home is a fantastic album. Naturally, it's a classic, monumentally influential. As I said earlier, probably one of the most influential records of the last 60 years, both musically and in terms of the lyrics. And nothing I can do or say will change the fact that this is a classic record that has gone down in history as one of the finest that there is. However, just because it's a great record doesn't mean it's not flawed. And I would argue that this album is flawed. Of the trilogy of rock albums that Dylan did in 65 and 66, this is easily the weakest for me. And it mostly comes down to the fact that there's something very tentative about the rock on side 1. From what I understand, the band was kind of thrown together in a hurry, and so it's not necessarily the most ideal setup. A lot of the material is very generic, a lot of which is normal for Bob Dylan. He's not necessarily the greatest songwriter who ever lived, and he has done his fair share of appropriating other people's work and not really crediting them for it. But usually when he does that, the results are spectacular. And here, they're actually a little less so. Side 1 is great, but I actually find Side 2 to be significantly better overall, which is interesting because I'm not the biggest fan of acoustic Dylan, and I'm not the biggest fan of folk music overall. There's something about that kind of white guy with an acoustic guitar plugging away for 6 minutes while nothing changes and it's just the same in the background that really doesn't do it for me. And so I struggle with some of this music, I think, a lot more than you're supposed to. I think a person with more conventional tastes is supposed to get this kind of music like that. But for me, I've always had to struggle with, you know, the simple acoustic music because I like clutter. I like a lot of things going on at the same time. And, you know, it's, for some reason, and a lot of acoustic music is very difficult for me. That being said, the second side is fantastic, possibly because there are only 2 actual acoustic songs. You know, there's electric guitar on Mr. Tambourine Man, there's bass on It's All Over Now, Baby Blue. But nonetheless, I still find Side 2 considerably better than Side 1. Honestly, in terms of mostly unadulterated folk, Side 2 of Bringing It All Back Home is probably the best that Dylan ever got, in my opinion. Now, as far as my personal experiences with this album, I don't necessarily have very many, because out of all the Dylan albums that I actually bought myself, because I had a lot of Dylan albums given to me at one point, this is probably by far the one I listened to least. It doesn't help that I bought this last out of the trilogy. I basically bought the trilogy in reverse. You know, I started with Blonde on Blonde, then Highway 61, and then this. And so, by the time I got to this, I was very underwhelmed by it. And I think listening to this last is a terrible mistake. Because I think at least when your tastes run the way my tastes run, listening to this last will damage your perception of it. Because I do find it to be the weakest of the 3. It's easily the least developed, and it's arguably the least essential of the 3. And because I bought it last, because I bought it honestly on the threshold of me getting out of Dylan the first time, I never really listened to it all that closely. In fact, I didn't listen to it all that attentively until about a week ago when I was preparing for these reviews. You know, I gave Blonde on Blonde and Highway 61 a lot of listening time back when I bought them, but this for some reason just kind of got passed over. And I like it a lot more, but it's still not really at the top of my Dylan list. I don't think any of his acoustic albums are necessarily better than this album, but there are definitely acoustic albums of his that I reach for before I reach for this one. But anyway, that was Bringing It All Back Home by Bob Dylan. I'm not as in love with the album as I think a lot of people are, but it's a fantastic record nonetheless. Definitely worth your time. Honestly, if you have any interest in the history of music or any interest in the music of the 60s, you owe it to yourself to check this album out. I'll be coming back to you shortly with a review of Highway 61 Revisited, but until then, I'll see you guys later.